Did I tell you, did I say that Jennifer couldn't be here for work shift? Yeah, she couldn't get off work.
Does she work in Worthington? That's what I thought. Well, I just know, I don't know if it's this way here at the hospital, but I know at the nursing home, they call in a lot of temp, they work with a couple of temp agencies because they're short-staffed.
Short-staffed, yeah.
How's it going, Kristen?
Good, you.
I was telling them, I like seeing our past students who work.
With the nursing home?
Yeah, they do a good job.
They do, yeah.
Paige Herman is one of my dad's favorite nurses. He said she's just, I always want to call her Faith, but I know her name isn't Faith. I said, it's Paige, Dad. I know. She's just so nice. They all are.
Yeah.
And then you've got some who have been there like for a long time. Kathy Curtis.
Clint's sister, Christy, has worked there since high school.
Christy, yeah. She's always so good. They're all just great
I
stuff.
guess I didn't say when we go and when you get to point 2,
Yeah.
you're supposed to technically ask if there's anyone that wanted to comment or speak.
Speak.
If we have any visitors, they would obviously fill it out.
Right.
And then they'll get to say their piece like we would normally.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, and then I'll
Do we-
present that.
Okay, is that, oh shoot. Just in case, does it say it on that sheet?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Was that what I read that from
Oh,
last time?
no, I don't have that one on here. I didn't think of adding
bring
that
my
on here.
Notebook with me.
I have it up here though.
Hmm?
If you want to read.
Okay.
That isn't from this meeting, but then you could read that point and then I could
That
jump
was
back
from a
in.
different meeting.
Yeah.
It's 5:30. Oh, here's Greg.
Great. So what's Teddy up to?
He's going to college at SDSU.
SDSU?
Yep.
I had that in mind, but I wasn't.
Yep.
Sometimes you're wrong and forget.
No, they're second year already. Just about got her done. Hard to believe.
Yeah, right. Okay. We'll go ahead and call the certified budget public hearing to order. With the first item here is
This is
if,
not the right.
no, I'm looking at this one. Is it on? Okay. First, we'll have Mr. DeZeo will present some.
I'll ask it. There's no one for public
Oh.
comment, right?
Right. Is there anyone that wanted to make any public comment tonight? Okay. Seeing none, we'll go ahead with Mr. DeZeo will present information to us.
Spreadsheet meetings a minute here. All right. So this is the preliminary certified budget information hearing for our next school year, which is FY 2025. I think from now on I'll put it as FY 25 in the presentation, but just so you know. And a reminder, the process is different this year. We have to have 2 hearings before it's officially approved. So this first one is tonight, and then at our April board meeting, we'd approve it, and we'll have a hearing before then. So just as a reminder, that's what's going on. The purpose of the budget process, is required is twofold: to establish and certify the rates for our next school year, which is FY 25, otherwise known as the 24-25 school year, and to show the overall estimated, key being estimated expenditures for the various district funds. The big thing about public education that's different than, the private sector or others is it's pupil driven, not expense driven. So it's all based off pupils for the most part, which we'll try and get into as we go here. Some areas of concern for our budget as we move forward, and we'll talk about it a little bit tonight here. Our enrollment projections, nothing new here that you're not aware of, but our enrollment projections are down, and the positive position that we are in will be spent down, and we've been having those conversations this year, and we know that, but that still has an impact on our budget. After this year, after this fiscal year, I should say, we will not receive any of those ESSER funds moving forward, the federal dollars from COVID, and those monies will end this year, FY24, so we'll have to monitor that impact in the next fiscal year, FY25 and beyond. In the past, some of those had been used for some reoccurring expenses that'll come now back onto our general expense, so just seeing that impact, and that has a little bit more of an impact when you're on reoccurring expenses versus one-time funds and so forth. So just being aware of that as we move forward. The high inflation rate, and the main reason I'm bringing that up is Iowa code dictates that if we would, and not that we would need to, but if we would have to go to mediation with staff, they set the rate at 3% or CPI, whichever's lower. So when the consumer price index is above 3%, we know at a minimum we're going to have at least a 3% settlement. And then just the uncertainty in the legislation, which I'm going to speak to tonight a little bit here, on our state supplemental aid, the SSA. It just hasn't met the overall increases across the state in operational expenditures. And when we're having a budget hearing and they haven't yet set it, that has an impact as well. And so not only Sibley of Cheatham, this is a statewide impact. It forces you to guess low or present artificially high numbers as a precaution, because you just don't know what that's going to be set at. So that will have an impact as well. Some strengths, we are in a strong financial position overall, thanks to good management and choices in previous administration and going back several years to Mr. Boer's era and so forth. It allows us to take some time to make some decisions that'll keep us strong moving forward, but we don't have to make those drastic decisions right now. I think it highlights the outstanding employees that we do have here that we're very thankful for. And although this won't always be true moving forward for a school our size, presently we still have 3 sections in our elementary, which is, I think, a thing to hold on to and be proud of. So we're very thankful for that. So I'll go through some slides. Some of this I might go back and forth a little bit just to present some information, and a few times I might stop and ask for questions. But as we talked about, our enrollment decreased last fall. If you remember, that number should look familiar. I said roughly 40 students. Last fall in October 23, that's FY24. Remember, the enrollment last fall in October of 2023 is what impacts our budget for FY25. We use that number, that enrollment number, so that's 648. That's our student enrollment budget number for the next year. I know that's confusing because you're using like 3 different years there, but you use the enrollment number from last fall. We use that number to set our budget for the coming year. And when I said our budgets are student or enrollment driven, that's what we're referring to. So that's one of the most important numbers right there, is that 648 number, 649 when you round it. And that should hopefully look familiar. We've talked about that number. This is special ed weighting. So there's additional funding that we can get beyond just our normal program costs that come from different things. And there's three main weightings, and so I'm going to talk about those. So the first one, if I go back here, is our certified enrollment. One of the next one is our special ed weighting. So that comes from when a student is in special ed, there's 3 levels. And depending on the level of special ed weighting, we get additional students or funding for that. And so one of the trends you can see here is, yes, we're down from last year to this year's projected for next year, and that should be expected. But really, the trend in our special ed enrollment weighting doesn't really follow the overall enrollment trend that we're having. And so you can see just a greater need for special ed services in our district, because even if that would hold steady, that means as our enrollment goes down, we're having a higher and higher percentage, and not like, exponentially higher, but we are having a little bit higher of our students receive special ed services, because you can see we dipped down this last year, but over the last 5 years that's gone up slightly versus our enrollment going down. So that's something that we have to keep track of. So we have roughly 72 students worth of special ed enrollment. Supplemental weighting. This is some additional student funding we get for some of the formula-driven funds that we have that come from things like operational sharing. We get some additional students for ELL, English as a Learned Language, or EL students, and et cetera. So for this coming year, we're estimating it to be at 29. Some of the things you might have in the past heard that we've gotten students from operational sharing, like we share a transportation director. Amos does a few things with HLP, so we get 4 students for that. Chrissy Ackerman with HR, we share with them, and Emmitsburg. We've done in the past maintenance between our district and GLR, which we are not doing next year, but each of those are 4 students. So that's where some of these come from. And that's something that I think moving forward, if we have declining enrollment and budgets, we'll continue to have to address and look at ways to maximize that. So that number, we won't come back to it often, but that's another number that some of our funds are impacted by. So overall, like I said, 3 areas. We have our certified enrollment, which is the primary and number 1 number that we need to know, the 648. But we have some additional funding for certain funds that come from special ed. That's that 72 number, I'll say, and then that supplemental weighting that comes from things like sharing, operational sharing, and ELL, and some other categorical things like that. It's just under 30 students. So we don't use the number a lot, but the total weighted enrollment is 751. Not very often that we add the 3 together, but you can see what it does add together. And you can see that, as expected, should have gone down over the last few years, just like our normal school enrollment, but not really. This is much zoomed in compared to our enrollment. It's not really going down at the same rate because we've had an increase, relatively speaking, in some of those special ed and EL populations that affect some of those numbers there. But you can just see over time that's gone down. So, connecting a few things, and then hopefully I'll get to a point you can ask a few questions here, but this just shows the state history of growth. And I put question marks intentionally because right now the state has not set what our rate of growth per student, the SSA, will be for next year. So you can see a history going back, and I tried to keep to 2014 and 15 on here because that's the last time there was a 4% increase in SSA. And if you go back before then, it was down a few years before then. If you remember the impact in the economy in about that 2010, 2009, 2011 range. But before that, 4% was pretty standard. Since then, you can see there's been some pretty slow and small increases on the yearly amount. So our district cost per pupil, that's a number that's set by the state. And depending on when you look that up, you might see that differently, because sometimes what the state sets in the spring, and we'll say, oh, it's $6,393. By the time it goes through the Department of Management with some of the formulas, that can fluctuate $1 or $2. So as I was looking that up some of the time, I found some different numbers, but that just comes from timing and things like that. But then that SA amount is based on that percentage, how much our funding per pupil has gone up annually. So if you go back to 2015-16 school year, with a 1.25% increase, the funding per pupil went up $80. And then you can see that goes line by line, if that makes sense. The 2023-24, I put an asterisk there because that was the first year our district cost, which is set by the state, equaled the state cost. Not all districts had the same cost, and the state has tried to do over time is make that equal. And so historically we had a higher one, but we are at the state average, and there's something like about 90 schools, I don't remember the number, that still have a different cost per pupil than the state average. But that's where that's coming from. So that 2%, I'm guessing low. At one point that was the suggested number for next fall, and you're going to see that 2% number throughout my presentation tonight here. But that's the guess. We've been hearing it's going to be 2.5 or 3% more than likely, but all the numbers we're using tonight are going to be based on that 2% number. So where that comes from is last year's, or this current year I should say, is cost per pupil, that's $7,635. If you figure out 2% of that, that's $153. So hence the funding or the cost per pupil that we get is up by $153. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so a lot of what we'll discuss is based off of that. So using that number, We put in some different numbers here, and this just shows kind of the impact if SSA, is set at different rates from 0 up to 3. And based on the budget that we have set for next year, what that looks like on the levy or the tax rate. Okay, regardless, we're gonna have the same new money next year due to decreasing enrollment and some funding things. If you compare the new money coming in, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but if you compare that new money coming in this year compared to last year, we're down about $2,700. The real important column, I think, is the budget guarantee. So what that means is you're guaranteed of your regular program district cost for the next year, you're guaranteed 101% of that, okay? The lower the amount of SSA that is set, that's less funding we receive from the state. And remember, our budget's enrollment driven, student driven, we're guaranteed a dollar amount, but if we get less funding from the state, that has to come from somewhere, then what happens is that gets put on property taxes. So you can kind of see that budget guarantee comes from property taxes. As we get more SSA, that amount keeps going down. So if we would get 0% from the state, that's a lot more money on that budget guarantee that comes back to our local taxpayers through property taxes. If we get 2%, and that's why I highlighted that as orange, that's $100,000 less than if we got 0% from the state. A big difference. So that final column's the budget guarantee. It's the difference between what we're going to get in funding through that formula or that funding mechanism per student. And it's the difference between that and 101% of that funding from the year before. It's called the budget guarantee. And hopefully we'll be able to explain that a little more as we go on here. Are we okay there? Okay. So the initial number where we get this from, it's called the regular program district cost. It's our cost per pupil, the district cost per pupil, DCPP. Some people call it state because throughout much of the state cost per pupil and the district cost is the same, but that's not true everywhere. That's set by the legislature, and then it's multiplied by our certified enrollment, that 648 number, roughly 649. So why I put that in question marks is we don't know. So I'm guessing if we get 2% SSA this year, that's $7,788 a student. We don't know. They haven't told us it yet. So that's what this is based upon, but it's a guess. So for next year, that amount, if we take that $7,788 times the number of our enrolled or certified enrollment students, that's where we get the base number here, our regular program district cost, the $5,052,000, okay? Whatever that number was last year, okay, we're guaranteed to get 101% of that, so keep that in mind. I'll explain that in a second because that was a little bit bigger number, okay? So where does this come from? This breaks it down, and I'm gonna just step up here to point this out. So you can see what our regular program, that dollar amount per student times by your enrollment, this is what we got last year, and this is under 2%. It'll be a little different if we get 2.5 or 3, but what it is this year, and you can see that's less. So we're guaranteed 101% of this number. So if you took this times 101%, you add these two numbers together, you're going to get that. That's why it's called the budget guarantee. Last year we were on that from the year before, so we needed 55,000. So you can see due to the enrollment, that's where we're making up that additional $200,000 there. The rest is all formula driven. Those are things that different funding streams that come in for TSS, money that we use to assist with paying teachers, teacher salary supplement it's called, early intervention, some of these AEA dollars, those are all formula driven based on enrollment. Some of them could be based off of our certified enrollment. Some might play into based on special ed funding, things like that. But when you factor that all in and the differences, you can see we're going to come to a number, that combined district cost number, $7.5 million, I'm rounding roughly. But we have our regular program budget up top there, which is going to be about $5 million plus that budget guarantee of $260,000, so $5.26 million, and then we have all these other additional things that come through the formula to get a combined district cost right now where we're at about 7.5 million. And you can see that's down, the difference is about 44,000 from the year before. We're good there. Okay, so going back how the state funds this, just as a reminder, our combined district cost, that 7.5 million and change, okay? All districts have a uniform levy, which means it's $5.40, okay? Those that are property rich versus property poor, okay? If you're property rich, that $5.40 provides a lot more funding, right? Than someone who's property poor at that same rate. And so to make it uniform across the state, that's where that state supplemental aid comes in to even that out. So some districts might receive more state supplemental aid than others based on how much they're getting from that uniform levy. And that is supposed to account for about 87.5% of your combined district cost between those two things. Some districts, as an example, if you were in Okoboji or Spirit Lake, that $5.40 goes a long ways. Okay, I don't know, but I'm guessing they don't probably get much state supplemental aid to fund that because they don't need to. I haven't looked at their books, but I'm guessing that's a pretty good guess, right? Versus someone in maybe southern Iowa where they probably have to receive a lot of state supplemental aid because they don't have a lot of property value. And then that last 12.5% to reach is then where you get additional taxes and levies where they come in from. So that's kind of a low-level representation, but how the state aid fits in with our local property taxes. So how that connects locally, this is right now, not a number we generated, but we get this from the Department of Management in the state, what the estimated total district tax valuation is for property, including the gas and electric for next year. And you can see from FY24 to FY25, that number in assessed value went up roughly just under 30 million, a little over 29 million, from 345 to 374. So that's the base number they're using when we make some of what these tax levy rates are at. It's based off the assessed value, which we don't have a say or control in the county. So what we're proposing, and once again, I used the 2% number. Some of these numbers would change or lower if it comes through with the legislature at 2.5% or 3%. From what we're hearing, 2% would be the lowest. That's why I went there. I didn't want to put it at 0 and have an artificially high rate. I guess that would have been a safer guess, but from what we're hearing, it's not supposed to go below 2. So last year, the levy to fund the general fund was $8.24 roughly. This year, to fund that with the budget guarantee and everything would be $8.47. You'll see later that number changes based on how much SSA funding we get. The instructional support, which I'll talk about later, that's the instructional support levy. That should be familiar. We renewed that last fall. That provides us some much needed additional resources and funding. The management levy, that's one of the few levies that we have a lot of control over. The top two are really formula driven. We have minimal control in setting them. It's based on our budget. The management levy is one that we have some, not ultimate, but we have some control over of what we need, and we've talked about the needs in there. The management pays for our property insurance. It pays for any early retirements, any other legal settlements, issues, things that come up that you need to have covered, and so forth. So one of the big drivers of the increase in that management levy has been, and we've talked about this, the increase in our insurance costs going up, which we'll have a discussion again this spring, but they've just skyrocketed the last few years, especially for property insurance in school districts. The voted plant and equipment levy, you'll hear us, the PEPL, property plant and equipment levy, there's two parts, the regular and the voted. The regular is board approved, the voted is approved through the voters. That's set and formula driven. And you can see that. So that's where at a 2% SSA right now, the proposed property tax levy would be roughly at $11.11, which is an increase of 65 cents roughly if you're rounding. If SSA goes up, which I'll talk about in a second, that increase would go down. This is the same chart, but just showing instead of the levy, it's showing out the dollar amounts. So you can see when I'm coming back here, when we go from the general fund, why that rate's going up. The dollar amount needed in the general fund is going up. And there's not just one thing that contributes to that. So it's really showing the same things, but it's showing the dollars behind that rate. And you can see, you know, our management rate went up, but we're needing more dollars in that this year and moving forward. So really it's the same chart, but showing the data from two perspectives there. Does that make sense? So the more SSA funding, the lower general fund dollars we would need to levy for, basically. So some other things that have a property tax impact. If you remember last month in the March board meeting, so last week technically, we approved setting the income surtax at 5% for both the instructional support levy and the PEPL, which I'll explain both those in a second. So the instructional support levy, that's board approved. We just did that, and I put June, September, because remember we approved it in June, but it didn't include the part, due to an error, it didn't include the part about income surtax, so we redid that in September. And I'll explain why that's important here, but it's roughly 10% of your regular program district cost. So whatever your regular program district cost, we can get 10% more funding. A certain percentage of that is through state aid, and the last, I believe 10 plus years, the state has not funded that part, so you don't get that, it's unfunded. The rest of that comes through local property taxes. One of the ways to reduce that is to have that income surtax. So for us, the instructional support levies, and it come to about $429,000 of additional support and finances for our district, which is great. It's used for a variety of things. It's very useful. To reduce that burden, that income surtax at 5%, then you can see reduces that property tax load by $233,000, if that makes sense. So we're still, for us, we're still getting the same funding. We're just talking about where that comes from. Does that kind of make sense there? Okay, so that's one of the things that we use that income surtax for. The other thing that affects our property tax that we use the income surtax for is the property, plant, and an equipment levy. Sometimes I say property, it's actually physical plant and equipment levy, but many people say property, but we're talking about the same things, or the PEPL funds, okay? That comes from two sources. There's the board approved part, which has to be renewed every 5 or 10 years. I don't remember the time frame on that off the top of my head. And then the voter approved part. And so the board approved part at 33 cents comes to roughly 135,000. The rest of that comes from the voter approved portion, and that's property tax as well. That comes to 274,000. By using the income surtax, we reduced the amount needed for property tax from if we had no income surtax, 274,000, we're reducing that down to 40, but we're still getting the same amount of funding there. So that's what would have the impact on property tax next fiscal year, just from the property, plant, and equipment levy. And remember, those are specified funds. They can only be used for certain things. A lot of times we talk about PEPL and SAVE together. We pay for our computer rotations out of that. There's some infrastructure in terms of servers and things like that. The roof repairs that we just approved last month, cement work, those funds come out of here, not out of the general fund. And that's what it's designed for. This, using that rate, if nothing changed, just shows our history back to FY16, so we're talking roughly 10 years of history here, so forth. And you can see then there is fluctuating. The last 4 years, roughly, it's roughly remained the same. And so, yes, with the declining enrollment this year, yes, that goes up. My hope is it won't actually be $11.11. If we're at 3%, it'll actually be less than 11. It'd be about 10, if I remember right, 10.99. If it's at 2.5%, it'd be 11.05. That rate will come down depending on what SSA is set at. But right now, this is what our best guess is. And then it can actually adjust after that based on the Department of Management fluctuations. I think anywhere from 1 cent to 10 cents, depending on how some state funding and things come in, that the management might adjust. But that's our best guess is what it would be right now. So using all of that stuff, we have what we call a break-even point. So we talked about our maximum district cost before that and there's a few different numbers in here, but you should see that regular program and the budget guarantee. Those numbers on top should look familiar. And these are some of the other funding that come in through the different weighting that we've talked about, whether it be just our certified enrollment or our special ed weighting or our operational sharing. That's where some of these dollars are generated from. They come in. And then we also have additional funding that's enrollment driven, and it's formula based from the state that comes in for the preschool. That line 28, the instructional support, we're talking about the instructional support levy, whether that's board or voted upon, that number, and then other miscellaneous income, federal revenues, things like that, ESSER dollars in the past that have come in that we won't have moving forward, comes to a little over 950,000 estimated for next year. So that comes to a rough estimate of a break even of 9,348,000 and change. So that means if we'd spend just that based on the estimated revenue coming in next year, based on our enrollment in some of these other formulas, that'd be our break-even point. You hear that in the private sector a lot. It's just a little different way to get there because it's not based on dollars coming in. It's all enrollment driven, and the dollars coming in and our expenses are all enrollment driven. Just a little different way to think of it, but that's where our break-even. Does that make sense? What we're talking about there? Okay. So now this next slide should hopefully connect to things we've talked about this year with our unspent balance. So that, I'll point that out, that I'm going to say 9.3 million, right? Okay, that break-even dollar, that's our estimated, as of right now, our estimated break-even for next year. Remember, one of the big things in school finance we've talked about is your unspent authority. So basically, we're going to get 9.3 million in authority next year through previous fiscal years, previous administration, and not spending in some of those years where we had lean years and making good decisions. You build up authority. So we have about an estimated coming into next year, and that's estimated. That number is not actual because we don't know what will happen this year yet fully, but we have a little over 3.8 million in unspent authority. So when you add that to your current break even, that means next year we'd have the authority to spend 13.2 million. Okay. Right now with expenditures, our rough guess, and hopefully we're high on this, that's always the goal here, but it'd be about 10.1 million. And so you can see, as I've talked about, we've been in a strong financial position, but that unspent authority is going to be spent down, and we got to start making decisions to slow that descent. But you can see then after next year, we go from 3.8 to 3.1 based on our best guess on unspent authority. So you can kind of see big picture. We've been talking about that all year, where that's coming from. Now remember that 3.8 numbers, that's not known either. That's a best estimate because we're still in the middle of determining that this year. But hopefully if everything else doesn't make sense, that unspent authority, or the UAB is what we've said in short, that should look familiar, hopefully, that number, or at least the conversations about it. So this is our unspent authority history going back to FY18. The blue are known, they're actual. And if you'd go back even farther, you would see that number being lower and then built up year after year. If you'd go, I think starting in like FY 12 or 13, right in there where we got a low point, but then it steadily rose through FY 22 into FY 23, which was last year. You can see we basically held steady, but it went down, if you do the math, about $8,000. And do you remember last fall we talked about when it was finally set, by the time we knew the numbers in September, October, we said our UAB went down about $8,000. And I said, if that was our trend, we could do that for a long time before we'd have to worry about it, right? The issue is if it gets on too steep of a decline, eventually we're going to run out of that extra authority here. So the orange is because that's the present year. We don't know that actual number. That's estimated as of right now on some Department of Management calculations. Kendra and I have talked about that. Hopefully That's maybe a conservative estimate, and hopefully at the end of this year, that could be a higher number. I don't know that it will be, but, we're gonna end at about 3.9. Could that end up at, 4 million instead, or 4.1? Somewhere in there, that'd be the hope. And we'll see, we won't know that till next fall, but would that be a fair way to state that, Kendra?
Yep.
Yeah, that's our hope. So based off, but we're using that as an estimate, 3.8, and then off next year's budget potentially, that we'd go down another 700,000 or so. That's where we get that 3.1 number from. So just bear in mind those last 2 years are estimates. So where does that put us? So right now our unspent authority, yes, that's going down, but they compare that unspent authority as a percentage of your budget. Okay? And we've in the past few years been above the 25%. We've had a high enough that, and not that I'm asking to right now, but some school districts you hear they have the authority to levy for cash. We couldn't do that because we had too high of an unspent balance. So on one hand, it's good to spend that down. It's just once you start spending that down, you got to make decisions so that it doesn't fall off the cliff. You want that to level out. But we are in a position where we're spending that down and we need to. So we're still at a strong, by those ratios, we're still at a strong unspent authority. You can see right where we fall, the good percentage. And the only reason it's not best is based on those metrics there, we're actually above their target. The target unspent balance from year to year would be in that 5 to 15% range, and we're above that. We're at 23% of our budget in unspent authority. And then I couldn't get the arrow to show without covering up the title there, but it's the solvency ratio, which is basically kind of a measure of cash on hand, and it factors in your categorical funding and things. So that rate right now estimated is at 20%. That one we'll have to keep an eye on. We've talked about, for a variety of reasons, we are spending down our categoricals. And to the point now I've talked about, for instance, our PD, we're going to spend all of that this year. So next year we're going to start out with just our allocation. We don't have carryover, which is an okay thing, but that's something to keep an eye on, because now when we overspend on PD, it's not carryover money, we're spending out of the general fund, right? Or if we overspend on our EL funding moving forward, we're not spending carryover on EL dollars, we're spending out of general fund. And that solvency ratio addresses that somewhat. So that's something to keep an eye on. We're still at a good range though right now. So hopefully those percentages, if you remember talking about those charts in the years past, and I know when I was principal having those conversations about spreading down the UAB, hopefully for those that have been on board, that sounds familiar. So questions that got us to this point that you guys have for me? All right, so this is the notice that was in the paper. And so now that you've seen the presentation, you should see where these numbers come from and look familiar. So the two I'll point out here, this was the notice in the paper, and then the ones that get sent out, that 10.46, that should look familiar. That was our rate last year. And now you see where that $11.11 and change came from this year, okay? I'll address this in a second. I'm not saying I got any questions, but I think this will cause a lot of confusion, not only locally, but statewide, the effective rate. Because it's not really an effective rate, but I'll explain that in a second here. So that's the proposed notice. I put that on there, and you can see where those dollars come from, and the dollar amounts on the right, where they came from, you can see where that was generated, okay? So this effective tax rate, and I did not create all this content, I got it someone, but what it is Iowa code defined and put that on there. And one of the services we subscribe to, ISFIS, and we use them for a lot of resources. His name's Larry. He said to be nice, he goes, the nicest thing I can say about it is they put it in here to confuse people. He goes, I don't know why else it'd be here. So Iowa code requires it to be on there. An effective rate should be for the same year. The taxes paid divided by your assessed value for a year is your rate of tax, which is those outside two boxes. The taxes we need that last year divided by the assessed value, roughly, simply put, was $10.46. This year it's $11.11, okay? What the effective rate is, they're taking last year's taxes asked for, divided into this year's assessed value. What does that tell us? I don't know, but the way they worded the code, that's what they put on there. And so I'm bringing this up in case you have people ask you as well, that it really doesn't say a lot, and that's the direction we've been given. This is, I screenshotted in the notices that were sent to our home, so this is mine that I scanned in. So that box in green, that was the current tax rate, that's this year's. The box in purple, that's next year's. And I crossed out the red because really, that doesn't tell us anything. That's last year's dollars asked for, last year's budget into this year's assessed value. It's mandatory, that's why it's on there, but I don't know that it tells us anything. Being that we're in March Madness and the NCAA tournament, I'd like to say I created this next one, but I didn't. I got this from someone, but this kind of effectively explains this. If you're a Cyclone fan, I'm gonna apologize, you'll have to bear with it, but it's a Hawkeye thing. So I got this from someone, they said, the effective rate if we applied this to basketball and Caitlin Clark. So they put her stats, and if you pay attention to the 3-point stuff, the effective rate would be like taking the number of baskets she made last year and divided it into the number of attempts this year. Is that a calculable number? Yeah, I mean, we can get a percentage from it. It 30.8. What does that actually tell you, though? I don't know. You know, taking last year's shots divided by attempts, that gives us a percentage that tells us what percentage she made, and this year's shots attempts makes sense. Hence, taking last year's asked for taxes divided by the assessed value, this year's asked for taxes divided by the assessed value makes sense. When you divide one into the next, that's in essence what that effective tax rate is. What does that do? I'm not quite sure, but that was a way that I had shared with me to kind of explain that if people had asked, and I thought, oh, if someone didn't fully understand that, that's kind of a different way to look at it, but that's what the effective tax rate is, if you were going to talk basketball shooting terms, I guess, right? So, questions about that you guys have for me?
So we've talked a lot in the last few years about that unspent balance and that we need to get some of that spent down,
Yep.
but
And that's afforded us the opportunity right now when we have declining enrollment that we don't have to, boom, cut this position right now, but we can do that naturally. I've said natural or bloodless attrition, you heard that term, so we just got to be aware of it and monitor it from year to year and keep an eye on it. That's all we got.
okay.
So the motion to adjourn.
Yep, seeing that we have this all presented and discussed, so do I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
Second,
Second.
okay, all in favor? Say
Aye. Aye.
And this meeting is adjourned. We will now move into if I can find it here. I think I got it.
I got it on the screen if you needed to.
Oh. Okay, we'll call to order our meeting. Approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay, that is, first thing on the list is the consider purchase of new kitchen equipment.
So they're looking for a steamer and kettle. It can be used together, but it's set up that it can be used separately as well. They have attached the quotes they've received on this. We typically use Martin Brothers for a lot of our deliveries and equipment, and so that'd be the recommended one, and that's the lowest bid anyway.
So this is replacement just for something that's
So-
already there?
Yes, the steamer is towards the end of its useful life. Not that it's not working, it is, but it's at the end of its useful life, and looking at replacing it now before we have to, type thing, is when they were looking at doing that. And as a reminder, this doesn't come out of general fund, this is out of the nutrition fund.
Is there any questions or anything on that? Okay. I ask.
Make a motion to approve the purchase of the kettle and steamer for the kitchen.
Second.
Is there a second?
Kristen.
Oh, Kristen did, sorry, Kristen. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that is passed. Then consider approval of resignations.
And the resignations are attached, and you can have them to read. What we are looking at doing, obviously at the high school one, we hired at the middle school, and we had talked about this, is that the right decision? And when I say we, the two principals, and we still feel, just to support our students and staff, it's still important to keep the 3 counselors, so we would look to do that. Likewise with the band position as well, we would look to fill that. We are looking at not filling the elementary Brandon's position, and that'd be one, like we've talked about, naturally absorbed, so that'd be a place where we'd go from 3 to 2 sections.
Is there any questions or anything in terms of this? Okay. Ask for a motion to approve the resignations.
I'll make a motion to approve the resignations as presented.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed? Okay, it's passed. Mention also that we appreciate the service that they've given to our district and the time that they've been here. Okay. That being said, is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Okay, second.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Sorry.
Meeting is adjourned.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Oop, that's not.
How long was a band teacher? Is that 2 years he's there or just 1?
2 or 3.
2?